My dearest brothers and sisters. This is Hakann speaking. I greet you in peace and love. A lot of people use the following as a rule of thumb. If something feels good or resonates with them, then that should be listened to. If something does not feel good or does not resonate with them, then it should not be listened to. In some situations, this rule of thumb gives good results. For example, if you read a hateful message, then typically that will not make you feel good. And indeed, hateful messages typically should not be listened to. However, in a lot of other situations, this rule of thumb can mislead people. For example, suppose that Anna has trauma about sex. She then reads a sex-positive message. This triggers her trauma, and so she feels bad, and this sex-positive message does not resonate with her. However, this message might be exactly what she needs. Or suppose that John feels like he is not good enough. Then he reads a message that states that he is good enough. This might give him cognitive dissonance, because now he has two opposite messages in his head. He both is good enough and is also not good enough. This makes him feel bad, so he concludes that this "you are good enough" message must be wrong. But perhaps he really is good enough, and it would be better if he discarded his old programming that he was not good enough. Or picture Tris, who does not give enough freedom to her teenage children. She reads a message that parents should give freedom to their teenage children. This makes her feel like a bad mother, so she resolves that by concluding that this new message must be wrong. Or imagine Hans has a not very accurate and not very useful worldview. If Hans finds an article that agrees with his worldview, then he immediately judges that article as being correct, because it resonates and makes him feel good. If he finds an article that contradicts his worldview, then he automatically judges that article as being false, because it makes him feel bad and doesn't resonate. But of course Hans isn't using some kind of higher guidance here. Hans is just discarding anything that does not fit in with his worldview. As a side note, people feel unsafe when their worldview is threatened. If you find it hard to have compassion with someone who clings to a false worldview, maybe you can have compassion with someone who is afraid. To continue with the examples, remember when you tried to tell truthful and helpful information to someone, but the information challenged their worldview, and they just refused to listen because the information felt wrong to them. Let's assume that in this situation you were right. Notice that from the outside, it looks very unwise that people discard information just because it makes them feel bad. On the other hand, a false message that flatters someone's ego might make that person feel good, but that message should not necessarily be listened to. Etc., etc. I could give another 100 examples similar to these. The common problem here is that the earthling in question has trauma or limiting beliefs or cultural hang-ups or an unintegrated ego. Then this leads to the earthling feeling bad when they hear truthful and helpful messages. And then they discard these truthful and helpful messages, because if something makes you feel bad then it's false, right? Perhaps a perfectly accomplished being could use this rule of thumb. And it would be accurate for them. But the vast majority of earthlings are not there yet. So, I suggest expanding the previously mentioned rule. If something makes you feel bad, I suggest first checking in with yourself. Is my ego or some trauma or some limiting belief or some cultural hang-up getting triggered? If yes, Tunia's message, How to Heal, may be helpful to you. If you are unsure, my message, How Do I Know What's True?, may be helpful. Note that if you find yourself projecting negative things onto the source of the message, even if you have no idea if these negative things are accurate, then this is a good sign that some of your old pain or limiting beliefs or ego may have come up. Suppose that none of these are true and you can say from sort of a detached place, "No, I'm not triggered, I just don't like the way this message makes me feel." In this case, yes, that is a pretty good sign to disregard that message. However, just because a message might not be useful for you personally at this time, does not mean that this message is not useful for other people in other situations. Therefore, we would be cautious about publicly saying that certain messages should not be listened to. For example, people at different levels of emotional and spiritual maturity benefit from different messages about power. After all, a recently born baby has no power. Sometime later, it's appropriate for the baby to start practicing power in a completely selfish and non-considerate way. After some time, it's appropriate for the toddler to start learning that other people exist too and have feelings too, and you should not hurt them. For a child, It's appropriate to learn about limits and dangers attached to power. Then for the adult, it's appropriate to use their power as they wish, so long as it does not directly harm others. Then for a spiritual person, at some point it might be appropriate to hand over their life to Source and to start living to serve Source. Although if the adult is traumatized, then they should not listen to a hand your power over to Source message and should instead first reclaim their own power for themselves. Or if the adult is selfish and destructive, they should be encouraged to briefly not use their power anymore. They should be given love and healing and room to relearn the lessons from childhood about not hurting others. As you can see, there is not one message about power that is appropriate for all people. What message about power is appropriate depends on the emotional and spiritual maturity of the person. Therefore, be careful about publicly saying, "This message is false, do not listen to it." Maybe you're right and this message really was crafted by dark beings to mislead people. In this case, sure, speak out. But maybe it's a helpful message and it just happens to not be helpful to you personally, but it will be helpful to other people. I hope this message was of benefit to you. I leave you today in peace and love. I love you very much. Your star brother, Hakann.